I'm going to talk today about the collapse, what caused it, how can we get out of it, and what can we learn from it. That's the plan. Now, the cause, what's the cause of what's happened? Well, of course, the cause of every economic bust is the boom that precedes it. It's gone back and traced all of these ups and downs, and this is one of the few places we can trace economic ups and downs is in the history of the stock markets. And he's gone right back to 1750, and as you can see, there have been lots of them, ups and downs, and every bust is in some way related to the boom that precedes it, because human beings they get great expectations on the basis of trends that have been happening, and they think that trees will grow to the sky and all that kind of thing, and before you know it, the market informs them that that's not the case, and things collapse and so on. And each of these contractions often, contractions come from a variety of sources. We don't have time today to talk about the different kinds of sources, but many of them have come from variations of public policy, either monetary policy or fiscal policy. What was the manifestation of the boom then in this particular circumstance? Well, it was the U.S. Housing market. Here's a chart of investment in housing in the United States, and as you can see, when that came unglued, it really came unglued. So that's the first part. The boom in the construction of housing was one part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is this one, we all know about it. The blue lines here are net equity extraction from mortgages from houses that people already owned, where they refinanced their house. They took the money out, and that showed up in a big boom in the percentage of disposable income that was coming from that source. And you can see that's the red line. And of course, when that merry-go-round stopped, then personal consumption expenditures. We all talked about how this was remember how it was a consumption-led boom. Well, a lot of it came from this particular source, and that's why this is the mechanical reason why it happened. Yes, that's what happened, but what caused it, really? Henry Kaufman and John Taylor blame Alan Greenspan. And they say the problem was that Greenspan pumped the money supply up, and this got the whole ball rolling. Well, we need to understand this, because if we're going to talk about remedies, and we're in particular going to talk about how we avoid this in the future, we really do need to know what caused this problem. And now I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about stuff that you'd rather I didn't talk about. And I'm now going to turn to my graphs. Because we need to challenge this question of whether Greenspan did it. And we have a natural experiment, actually, ladies and gentlemen, to test whether Alan Greenspan did it or not. Canadian policy is around the world held up as the shining example of how it should have been done, right? Does everybody agree with that? Yeah, everybody says, if you go to Zurich, anyway, you go to London, they say, oh, you guys got it right. Now the question is, did Canada have a better monetary policy than the US? Nobody has asked that question. They compare with the US with Europe, but nobody thinks to ask the question. Here we have two economies side by side. We're the 13th Federal Reserve District, for heaven's sakes. How did we manage our circumstance, and did we do the same? Did we do better or whatever? Well, when you look at this chart, this is the instrument of choice of both Canada and the United States in putting into effect monetary policy. The red line is the Canadian bank rate. The red line is the U.S. federal funds rate. The yellow line is Canadian bank rate. And look at this central point here. This is why many people who I braided on this question said, oh yeah, no, Greenspan got it wrong even by comparison with Canada, because during that period of time he ran interest rates too low in the U.S. compared to Canada. Well, I looked around to see, well, was there any other explanation for that difference in the monetary policy between the two countries other than Alan Greenspan making a mistake? And here's what I found when I looked at the inflation differential between Canada and the United States. This is the difference between the inflation rates. Now, in Canada, what do we do in monetary? What does the Bank of Canada do? It follows inflation rates. And if inflation rates go up, they jack up interest rates. Inflation rates go down, they drop interest rates, right? So what we had during that period of time was we had a big acceleration in our inflation rate in Canada. Right down here, you see how much differential changed from there to there. You can see that we had a relatively big change in the comparative circumstances that we faced in Canada compared to the United States. And so, during that period here, I've superimposed the inflation rate on what happened. Of course, the Bank of Canada ran a tighter monetary policy because we faced a different set of issues. Remember the discussions in the United States and the concern about deflation. That was what they were looking at. We were looking at an acceleration in the inflation rate, so that's why we see that difference. Well, if Greenspan didn't do it, who or what did do it to the United States? This is a chart that I believe explains to a considerable extent what happened in the United States and indeed what happened in the world. We had, during the period from the middle of 2000 until the middle of 2003, a massive reduction in mortgage rates. In fact, long-term interest rates of every kind. We had a massive reduction in interest rates. Now, what happens when you're talking about long-term assets, like a house or something that, you know, a piece of land or whatever, what happens to the value of that when you have a big drop in interest rates? What do people think? It goes up. And how much does it go up? Well, as a matter of fact, that decline in interest rates that we're looking at here would be responsible for a 56% boost in housing purchasing power and therefore housing asset values, and incipiently housing. What that means is that if you said, I'm going to give 30% of my income or 20% of my income or whatever it is to buying a house and supporting it, if you have that kind of drop in interest rates, you can use that same amount of income, that same percentage of your income, and you can buy 56% more house. Now that's what happened because of a reduction in interest rates. And of course it also happened that I'm putting back this chart about people taking the money out of their equity. Not only was this of interest to people who were going to buy a new house, it was the people who were sitting on a house and said, you know what? I can pay the same amount of mortgage. I guess I can change my mortgage. I can pay the same amount. I can have 56% more purchasing power relative to this asset. And so they took it out and they bought boats and cars and all that kind of thing. They bought all the things that they bought, pickup trucks in the case of the people who were getting very short-term mortgages so that they'd have something to pack all the furniture that they bought into when the house collapsed. So people, this is how people quite rationally responded to this big reduction in interest rates. Okay, but what pushed mortgage rates down? We're still, you've got to keep digging here. Why? Well, mortgage rates are the sum of the real interest rate and the inflation rate. That's what we always think about, right? If inflation rates go up to 10%, what happens to the interest rates? They go up by 10%. Those of us who lived through the 80s know they can go up to 20% if you get the inflation rate up to 17%. So that's the basic equation. It's real interest rates, it's the rate of inflation. Now here comes the great triumph that I was talking about, the triumph of Milton Friedman over world inflation rates. Milton Friedman got the central banks of the world to look at inflation rates and to drive inflation rates down. And this is one of the most staggering graphs that you're ever going to see about economics. This is a triumph because we're not going to see inflation rates go back up, I don't think. And this is an important point of optimism about the future. But the second chart shows us here is the real rate of interest during, again, the same period. The real rate of interest as measured here by the rate of return on indexed government bonds. Now, I understand that it's not perfectly a measure of the real rate of interest, but it's pretty close. And what happened to it over this period leading up to this housing correction that we're talking about? It fell in half.